Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a journey into the human body that's going to fundamentally change the way you look at a simple slice of bread. We are tackling a condition that's been called the clinical chameleon, and trust me, that nickname is earned.
It really is. It's a fitting name.
A master of disguise.
Absolutely.
We're talking about coeliac disease, and before anyone rolls their eyes and thinks, oh great, another gluten-free fad conversation, just stop right there. Put down the preconceptions. Because the research we have pulled for this dive, and it's a stack of heavy hitters.
It is.
We've got a major seminar from The Lancet in 2022, a huge primer from Nature Reviews back in 2018, and a brand new 2025 Journal Club update on diagnostic breakthroughs. And all of it paints a very, very different picture than what you might see on social media.
Absolutely. We are moving way past the headlines about, lifestyle choices here.
Yeah.
We are looking at a systemic autoimmune disorder that for the longest time was considered a rare condition affecting wasting children.
Right. The classic textbook image.
Exactly. But now we know it affects roughly 1% of the global population. And the fascinating, slightly terrifying part is that the numbers are growing.
That is the part that got me. It's not just that we're better at diagnosing it, the actual incidence seems to be rising. So our mission today is to unpack the biological warfare. And that's really what it is, happening inside the gut of someone with coeliac disease. We want to understand why bread is the enemy for these individuals, how the immune system gets so confused, and why, and this is just a staggering stat, up to 70% of cases are still submerged. They're like an iceberg, completely undiagnosed.
That iceberg analogy is central to understanding this. For so long, we only saw the tip, the severe cases with obvious malnutrition. But underneath the water, there is this massive population dealing with symptoms that don't look anything like a digestive problem.
Okay, so let's set the scene. This isn't just about bloating or feeling a bit off after a bowl of pasta. We are talking about genetics, we're talking about enzyme traders, and a protein that essentially refuses to die.
And in a way, coeliac disease is a unique model for understanding autoimmunity in general, because unlike, say, lupus or multiple sclerosis, where we are often guessing at the trigger, with coeliac disease, we know the trigger. It's gluten.
We have the smoking gun.
We have the smoking gun. We know the environmental factor. We know the genetics, and we know the mechanism. It's a perfect storm.
A perfect storm. I like that. Okay, let's unpack that storm. Let's get into the mechanics of it. Part 1. Pathogenesis.
It really is a convergence of 3 distinct elements. You can think of it like a 3-legged stool. You need the dietary gluten, obviously. That's leg 1.
Right.
But you also need the genetic susceptibility and then some environmental factors that, to be honest, we're still trying to pin down.
Let's start with the genetics because the sources call them the gatekeepers.
They are the gatekeepers.
The HLA genes. This really stood out in the Nature Reviews paper. They talked about HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8. It sounds a bit like a droid from Star Wars, but these are actually receptors, right?
Exactly. These are human leukocyte antigens. Think of them as the bouncers of your immune system. Their job is to present molecules to your immune cells, specifically your T cells, and ask, is this safe or do we attack?
So in coeliac disease, these bouncers, HLA, DQ2, and DQ8, they make a mistake.
It's more of a structural issue. We call it a lock and key mechanism. These specific genes create a receptor, a sort of docking bay, that happens to bind very, very tightly to certain gluten fragments. If you don't have these genes, and specifically about 90 to 95% of patients have one called HLA-DQ2.55, you basically cannot get coeliac disease.
So if I don't have the gene, I can eat all the baguette I want.
For the most part, yes, regarding coeliac disease. If you lack HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8, your risk is virtually zero. That's why genetic testing is so good for ruling out the disease. It has a fantastic negative predictive value.
Yeah.
But here is the paradox, and this is where it gets really interesting.
I love a good medical paradox.
About 30 to 40% of the Western population carries these genes.
Wait, 40%? But you just said only 1% of people have the disease.
Precisely. Having the gene is necessary but not sufficient. Just because you have the lock doesn't mean the key will ever turn. Most people with these genes live their whole lives eating gluten without a single issue.
Wow.
So while genetics opens the door, something else has to walk through it.
And the sources mentioned that while HLA is the big boss, there are other genetic players too, like smaller ones.
Yes, exactly. Genome-wide association studies, or GWS, have identified about 41 other genetic loci spots on the genome that contribute a tiny bit of risk. But even if you add them all up, they explain only a fraction of the heritability compared to the HLA genes. It's mostly about those bouncers.
Okay, so the bouncer's letting people in, but a fight doesn't necessarily break out. Let's talk about the troublemaker walking through the door. Gluten.
The villain of the story.
But not just any gluten. The sources got really specific about something called the 33-doomer.
Yes, this is crucial. So gluten is a complex protein found in wheat, rye, and barley. It acts as the glue that makes dough stretchy. That's its viscoelastic property. But biologically, it's very strange. It's incredibly rich in two amino acids, proline and glutamine.
And why does that matter to our stomach?
Because humans, evolutionary speaking, are not really equipped to break those bonds. We lack the specific enzymes, they're called proleendopeptidases, to fully digest these proline-rich sequences. So when you eat a piece of chicken, your body breaks it down into individual amino acids. Simple. But when you eat gluten,
it's different.
It breaks down into these long, indigestible fragments. And the most famous one, the most immunogenic one, is a peptide that is 33 amino acids long, the 33-man fragment.
So this 33-pomer fragment just survives digestion? Like, it makes it through the stomach acid and everything?
It survives gastric acid, it survives pancreatic enzymes, and it arrives in the small intestine completely intact. Now, for most of us, for the 99%, that fragment just passes through. It's harmless waste. But for someone with Coeliac disease, that fragment is what we call immunotoxic.
It's a toxic leftover. But it doesn't do the damage alone, right? There was an accomplice mentioned in the Lancet paper, an enzyme called tissue transglutaminase, or TG2.
The traitor.
A traitor. I like that. What does TG2 normally do?
Normally, TG2 is a good guy. It's an enzyme that's involved in tissue repair. It cross-links proteins, helps wounds heal. But in the gut of a coeliac patient, when it encounters that gluten fragment, that 33-woomer, it tries to modify it. It performs a process called deamidation. It chemically changes the gluten, giving it a negative charge.
Then that negative charge is the problem.
It's catastrophic. Remember our bouncers, HLA-DQ2 and DQ8.
The droids.
Right. Those receptors have a pocket that loves that negative charge. The modified gluten binds to the HLA receptors with incredibly high affinity. It fits the lock perfectly. And once it binds, the immune system, specifically the T cells, sees this complex and just goes, foreign invader, attack.
And that's when the war starts.
That is exactly when the war starts. The T cells release a storm of inflammatory cytokines. These are chemical distress signals like interferon gamma and IL-21. This revs up the adaptive immune system. But it doesn't stop there. It also triggers the innate immune system. You get this massive release of another cytokine, interleukin-15 or IL-15, which reprograms the lymphocytes that are already lining the gut, the intraepithelial lymphocytes, and it turns them into killers.
Killer lymphocytes? That sounds intense.
It is. They start destroying the enterocytes, which are the cells lining your intestine. And in the middle of all this chaos, the body starts producing antibodies. And this is the key to the autoimmune part. It doesn't just make antibodies against the gluten, the invader. Because the enzyme TG2 is physically attached to the gluten during this process, the body gets confused. It starts making antibodies against itself, anti-TG2.
That is the literal definition of autoimmunity, the body attacking its own repair crews.
Correct. And the result of all of this, the killer cells, the inflammation, the autoantibodies, is the destruction of the villi. Those are the tiny finger-like projections in your small intestine that absorb all your nutrients. They get flattened out. It's a condition called villus atrophy.
So you essentially lose your shag carpet and you're left with a tile floor that can't absorb anything.
That is the perfect analogy. And that malabsorption leads us directly into why the symptoms are so incredibly varied.
Great. Part 2, the clinical chameleon. You mentioned the iceberg earlier. The Lancet source had that staggering stat that up to 70% of cases are undiagnosed.
It's because for decades, medical textbooks taught that coeliac disease was a pediatric condition. You looked for a toddler with a distended belly, skinny limbs, and chronic diarrhea. That was the classical presentation.
But that's not what we see mostly now, is it?
Not at all. That classical form is actually the minority now, especially in adults. Today, the most common presentation is non-classical. It might be an adult woman, since it's more common in women, with a ratio of about 2-to-1, who comes in with iron deficiency anemia that just won't go away, no matter how many iron pills she takes.
Because she can't absorb the iron.
Exactly. Or it presents as chronic fatigue, or bloating, or even constipation, oddly enough, rather than diarrhea. The symptoms are all over the map.
The list of extraintestinal symptom stuff happening outside the gut was wild to read. I mean, dental enamel defects, how does that work?
It's a permanent record of childhood malnutrition. If the disease is active while the permanent teeth are forming, the malabsorption of calcium and other minerals causes these permanent grooves or pits or discoloration in the enamel. Sometimes a dentist is the first person to suspect coeliac disease in a patient.
Incredible. And then there's the skin, dermatitis herpetiformis.
The coeliac of the skin. It's this intensely itchy, blistering rash. It usually shows up on the elbows, the knees, the buttocks. And what's really interesting is that people with the rash often have very little obvious gut damage or symptoms. It's like the disease is choosing to manifest primarily in the skin.
But it's the same mechanism.
It's the same disease. The antibody, specifically IgA deposits in the skin, which triggers the inflammation and the blistering.
The one that really scared me was the neurological stuff, gluten ataxia.
This is a bit controversial, but it's becoming more and more recognized. You have patients who lose their balance, their coordination. They can't walk a straight line, or they suffer from peripheral neuropathy. That's tingling and numbness in the hands and feet. It turns out antibodies can cross-react with proteins in the cerebellum, the part of the brain that controls balance.
That's terrifying. And what about reproductive health? The sources mentioned that too.
It's a huge issue. Unexplained infertility, recurrent miscarriages, delayed puberty in kids. If a woman has unexplained infertility, screening for coeliac disease should absolutely be on the checklist. It's all tied to malabsorption of key nutrients like folate and iron, plus the systemic inflammation disrupting the whole hormonal axis.
And we can't forget the asymptomatic cases, the silent coeliacs.
Which is, in a way, the most frightening group. You have people with total villus atrophy, a completely flat gut lining on biopsy who say, I feel fine. They're usually only found because a first-degree relative gets diagnosed and the whole family gets screened.
But if they feel fine, why does it matter? Why treat it?
Because the damage is still happening. The inflammation is still simmering. They're still at a much higher risk for the long-term complications, like osteoporosis, because they aren't absorbing calcium and vitamin D or nutrient deficiencies, and in rare cases, even lymphoma. It's a ticking clock, even if the alarm isn't ringing.
And it brings friends, right? The sources listed a bunch of associated conditions.
It does. Because of the shared genetics, those HLA genes we talked about, coeliac disease often runs in the same families as type 1 diabetes and autoimmune thyroid disease like Hashimoto's. There's also a very strong link with Down syndrome and Turner syndrome. If you have one autoimmune condition, your risk for another skyrockets.
That brings us to a really important question. How do we catch this chameleon? How do we find the people on the submerged part of that iceberg? Part 3, the changing landscape of diagnosis.
So traditionally, the gold standard was a two-step process. First, a blood test, a serology screen for those anti-TG2 antibodies we talked about, specifically the IgA type. If that was positive, you then had to go for an upper endoscopy.
A scope down the throat.
Right, where a gastroenterologist takes a few tiny biopsies from the small intestine, and they look at those under a microscope.
And they look for that flat floor appearance, the villus atrophy.
Exactly. They use a grading system called the Marsh classification. Marsh 0 is a normal, healthy gut lining, and it goes up to Marsh 3, which is total atrophy.
But the Journal Club update from 2025 discusses a major paradigm shift, something that started around 2012 and was validated in 2017, the no biopsy approach.
This is a huge game changer, predominantly for children. The European guidelines from ESPGA suggested that, look, if a child has symptoms and their tTG-IgA levels are sky high, and we're talking specifically more than 10 times the upper limit of normal, and you can confirm it with a second positive antibody test, usually for endomysial antibodies, or EMA, you won't be able to skip the biopsy altogether.
That is huge. No general anesthesia, no invasive tube for a kid.
It is. The 2017 ABCD study, which our source mentioned, validated this. They looked at a huge cohort of kids and found that this triple criteria had a positive predictive value of 98.8%. That is incredibly high. It basically means if you meet those criteria, it is almost certainly coeliac disease.
But, and there's always a but, this doesn't apply to everyone.
Correct. The expert consensus is that we have to be prudent. This rule applies very well to symptomatic children with those extremely high antibody levels. It's still debated for adults, and it definitely doesn't apply if your antibodies are only slightly elevated. In those borderline cases, or in rare seronegative cases where the blood test is negative but symptoms persist, the biopsy is still the king.
And there is one massive pitfall in diagnosis that we absolutely have to mention, the gluten challenge.
Oh, this is the heartbreak of the clinic. We see it all the time.
Yeah.
A patient comes in and says, I felt terrible, so I read something online and I cut out gluten 3 months ago. Now I feel great. Could you test me for coeliac disease?
And you have to tell them.
We can't. Not accurately. All our tests The antibodies in the blood, the damage on the biopsy, they depend on the immune system actively fighting gluten right now. If you haven't eaten gluten, the antibodies can disappear and the gut can heal, sometimes surprisingly quickly.
So to get a diagnosis, they have to start eating it again.
Yes. They have to reintroduce gluten, usually a significant amount every day for weeks or even months, to trigger the damage again, just so we can see it. It's miserable for them because they feel sick all over again. That's why the message is always, do not stop eating gluten until after you get properly tested.
That is such a crucial piece of advice. Okay, so let's say you get the diagnosis, you have the papers. What now? Part 4, the reality of treatment.
Currently, there is one and only one medicine, and that is a strict, lifelong, gluten-free diet.
And I think for people who don't have this, gluten-free sounds simple. You just swap your burger bun for a lettuce wrap and you're good. But the sources highlight that the threshold for what is safe is incredibly low.
It's microscopic. We're talking about 20 parts per million. That's the international standard.
What does that look like in real life? What is 20 ppm?
Think of a single crumb. A literal crumb of whole wheat bread falling into your big pot of gluten-free soup. That could be enough to trigger the autoimmune reaction and keep the gut inflamed for weeks. It's why cross-contamination is such a major issue.
That explains the anxiety. The psychosocial impact section of the Nature Reviews paper was heavy. It talks about hypervigilance.
Imagine every meal is a potential minefield. You can't just go to a restaurant and trust the menu. You have to interrogate the waiter, the chef. Are they using the same tongs for the regular pasta and the gluten-free pasta? Is there flour in the air from the pizza oven? Is there gluten in the soy sauce?
It must be exhausting.
It leads to social isolation. Teenagers especially struggle with this because they just want to fit in to eat pizza with their friends. It's a huge burden.
And nutritional gaps, too. If you just swap out all your wheat products for processed gluten-free substitutes, you can run into trouble, can't you?
Definitely. A lot of processed gluten-free food breads, cookies, pastas is often higher in fat and sugar and lower in fiber, B vitamins, and iron than the wheat version it's replacing. They have to use extra fats and stabilizers to mimic the texture that gluten normally provides. A gluten-free cookie is still a cookie, and often a less healthy one.
Let's touch on the oats controversy. Because oats are naturally gluten-free, but the sources were a bit conflicted on this.
It's tricky. Oats themselves are great high-fiber, good vitamins. But there are two problems. One, cross-contamination. Most oats are grown in fields next to wheat or processed in the same mills. So regular oats from the supermarket are almost always contaminated. You need certified pure or gluten-free oats.
And the second problem
is biological mimicry for a small subset of patients. Avenin, which is the protein in oats, has a structure that in some rare cases can be recognized by the same T cells that react to gluten. It's not common, but for some, even pure oats cause inflammation. So typically we advise newly diagnosed patients to avoid oats entirely at first, let the gut heal completely, and then maybe slowly reintroduce the pure ones later while monitoring symptoms.
Wow. Okay, so for most people, the diet works. But for a small, unlucky group, it doesn't. This is refractory coeliac disease.
This is the most serious end of the spectrum. Refractory means the gut isn't healing despite a strict, and I mean a meticulously strict diet for over 12 months.
There are two types, right?
Yes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is usually manageable with steroids or other immunosuppressants to calm the inflammation down. But type 2 is effectively a pre-lymphoma state. The immune cells in the gut, those killer lymphocytes, have mutated. They've become clonal, meaning they are all identical copies of the same abnormal cell. And they're proliferating out of control, even without gluten. This carries a very high risk of developing a specific cancer called enteropathy-associated T-cell lymphoma, or EATL. It's an aggressive cancer.
So follow-up is critical.
It's everything. You can't just diagnose and say, goodbye, eat gluten-free. We need to follow up, repeat the blood tests, and sometimes even repeat the biopsy to make sure the gut is actually healing.
That is sobering. It really drives home that this is a serious medical condition. But let's look forward. Part 5, the frontier. Why is this happening, and can we fix it without just banishing bread forever?
The why is the billion-dollar question. We know the prevalence has doubled, maybe even quadrupled in the last 50 years. Genetics don't change that fast. Evolution takes thousands of years. So it has to be the environment. Something changed.
The sources mentioned a few suspects. The hygiene hypothesis.
That's a big one. The idea that we are too clean. Our immune systems evolved to fight off constant threats, parasites, bacteria. Now, in our modern sanitized world, they're bored. So they turn on harmless things like food proteins.
What about the wheat itself? Has it changed?
That's another major area of research. Modern wheat breeding. We have bred wheat to be pest-resistant, and high yield. Some studies suggest modern varieties are higher in certain proteins called ATS, amylase trypsin inhibitors, which are natural pesticides in the plant that might trigger our innate immune system and create an inflammatory environment in the gut.
And we did try to prevent it in children, right? The TEDdy and Prevent CD studies mentioned in the Lancet review.
Yes, there was huge hope and then a huge disappointment. They looked at infant feeding. Does breastfeeding protect you? Does introducing gluten early, at 4 months or late at 12 months, make a difference? And the answer, after studying thousands of at-risk kids for years, was a resounding no. The timing of gluten introduction did not stop the disease from developing.
That is so frustrating. It feels like the train is already on the tracks by the time they are born.
It does seem that way for many. We're also looking very closely at the microbiome. Patients with coeliac disease often have dysbiosis, an imbalance of their gut bacteria. But we still don't know the chicken and egg problem. Does the dysbiosis help cause the disease, or is it just a result of the inflammation?
So if we can't prevent it yet, can we treat it with drugs? The pipeline looks active, at least.
Active, but still in early stages. There are 3 main approaches being tested right now. First, enzymes. These are pills you would take with your food, they're called glutinases, that are designed to chop up that toxic 33-mer in the stomach before it ever reaches the small intestine.
Like a lactate pill for gluten.
Exactly like that. But it's much harder to do because gluten is a tougher protein and the stomach is an acidic, churning mess. One candidate, lataglutenase, showed some promise in reducing symptoms, but it struggled to fully heal the gut in major trials.
Okay, second approach.
Tight junction modulators. Drugs like larazotide. The idea here is to zip up the leaky gut. It reinforces the connections between the intestinal cells so those gluten fragments can't sneak through the wall to meet the immune system in the first place.
And the third, the holy grail.
Tolerance induction. Essentially, vaccines.
To teach the body to chill out.
Basically, using things like nanoparticles like the TK101 drug to deliver tiny amounts of gluten to the immune system, but in a safe context, telling the T cells, this is not a threat. Stand down. Tolerate this.
That would be the dream, a life without cross-contamination fear. But as of right now,
nothing is approved. The diet is still king. And these drugs, if and when they come, will likely be adjuncts to the diet, not replacements. There will be safety nets for accidental cross-contamination rather than a license to go out and eat a whole pizza.
So, to sum this all up, we've gone from what we thought was a rare pediatric disease to a common systemic lifelong condition that requires constant daily vigilance.
It is a massive shift in our understanding over just a few decades.
And if you are listening to this, whether you have coeliac disease or know someone who does, or you just work in a kitchen, understanding this biology is so important. It destigmatizes the whole gluten-free label. It's not a preference. It's not a fad. It's a medical necessity.
Absolutely. It is biological warfare, and the patient's gut is the battlefield.
I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. We talked about how the prevalence has skyrocketed in just a few decades. If genetics are the loaded gun and the environment is pulling the trigger, what exactly have we done to our environment or our food in the last 50 years that has turned a staple grown, the staff of life, into a trigger for autoimmunity for millions of people? It makes you wonder what other chameleons are hiding in plain sight.
That's the question that keeps researchers up at night.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.